Hexham, there were different levels of comfort according to your wallet. The dungeon was for the penniless. No windows, fresh air, or, I hesitate to tell you, toilet facilities. Whereas on the ground floor you did have a lavatory, and on the first floor you had a fireplace. Or if you were really flush, you could live up here on the top floor with the jailer, who had not only a lavatory, but 2 fireplaces. Trial by jury was, curiously enough, voluntary. Mark you, if you refused to stand trial, you'd be pressed between giant stones until you either agreed to stand or died. And throughout the Middle Ages, that was really the only torture that was used in England as part of the judicial system. It wasn't to get you to confess anything or punishment, it was simply to force prisoners to face trial.
Perhaps it's no wonder a lot of people preferred to escape the system by being outlaws, especially those facing serious charges like murder. The idea of hiding out here in the Greenwood must have had its attraction.
But don't go thinking being an outlaw wouldn't be all that bad, because you could always live a carefree life in the freedom of the forest. The forest was, in fact, almost the reverse of everything we think, even down to the fact that it didn't have to have trees in it.
One of William's first acts as conqueror was to create the New Forest. Well, I always imagined that meant he'd planted an awful lot of trees so people could enjoy a nice picnic in the shade. But no, what it actually meant was that the king grabbed vast tracts of land, including entire towns, to be his own private hunting park. To protect these parks, he imposed harsh laws known as forest law. The forest was simply wherever forest law applied. It was policed by an army of royal officials who ruthlessly enforced the draconian penalties for poaching imposed by the king. The Earl of Cardigan is the 31st hereditary warden of Savernake Forest. His family have been patrolling these woods on the lookout for outlaws and poachers since the time of the conquest.
Anybody of the local population ever found disturbing the king's deer was in for some horrendous punishment, yeah.
Well, what sort of things would they do to them?
Well, I think the standard one was if you'd used your bow and arrow, which presumably you had to kill your deer or kill the king's deer, and you'd drawn in your bow with your 2 fingers, in extreme cases, you forfeited those 2 fingers, so you could never again draw your bow on the king's deer.
Oh, I see. So hence the...
That's apparently where the expression comes from. Apparently it was shown to the knights at Agincourt. The English archers showed their 2 fingers to show they could still draw their bowstrings. 100 yards, half left, under those trees. Straight in front of where you're looking now.
Oh, yes! William the Conqueror was said to love stags as much as if he were their father. And Henry I put poaching on a par with murder. Richard I set the penalty for killing deer as removal of eyes and testicles.
If you owned a farm on the edge of the forest and the king's deer came out and wiped out your crop, that was your bad luck. You couldn't even fence the royal deer out of your fields.
You weren't even allowed to fence them out?
No, in lots of ways. The deer were rated, the deer of the forest had more rights and privileges than the locals who lived around it.
Maybe that's one of the reasons why the Robin Hood stories were so popular. They celebrated a time before the conquest when the forests were a place of freedom. Since the Normans, the forests had become a place of repression and brutal punishment. But once, people had been free to hunt and gather wood here, and that was never forgotten. Losing an eye for poaching deer, or having a hand cut off, may seem like pretty rough justice to us. But mutilation was a fairly common penalty, and for very good reason. It was a way of not only punishing criminals, but of identifying them in the days before photo ID cards. If you saw a man without an ear, it was a fair bet he was an ex-con. In the 13th century, a certain John de Roughton lost his ear after being kicked by a horse, so he insisted on carrying a certificate around with him stating that his earlessness was due entirely to medical causes. Outlaws and violent criminals who faced the death penalty had plenty to choose from.
it all depended where they were to be executed. In Sandown, you'd be buried alive. In Pevensey, you were thrown in the river at high tide. In Portsmouth, you were burned. And in Hastings, you'd be chucked off a cliff into the sea.
Here in Halifax, you'd find yourself at the cutting edge of execution technology. The city was the proud owner of a state-of-the-art guillotine. 500 years before the Frenchman, Monsieur Joseph Guillotine, gave his name to it. Makes you wonder what they'd called it, you know. Oh, we must execute him with that thing that has no name yet. What do you mean, the guillotine? Oh, shh, you cannot call it that. Monsieur Guillotine has not given his name to it yet. Local residents often made reluctant executioners, so the city would resort to poetic justice. If the thief had stolen a horse or cow, a rope would be attached to the animal and then connected to a pin supporting the blade. They'd then whip the animal, the pin would get pulled out, and the thief would be executed by his own booty.
Becoming an outlaw was one way of avoiding the cow-operated guillotine, but there was another alternative. You could always run like hell to your nearest sanctuary.
A lot of people sought sanctuary in the town of Beverley, and with good reason. Any criminal on the run was safe once he could reach that stone over there. You see, the area of sanctuary around Beverley was enormous. It stretched in a circle 2 miles in radius from the city centre, all marked out by these sanctuary stones. Once you reached here or could touch the stone, you were safe from prosecution. In fact, if I'd been being pursued and my pursuer killed me while I was on this side of the stone, he'd have to pay the church a fine of £8. Mark you, I suppose there'd have to be a few witnesses, but...
Here in Beverley, the heart of the sanctuary was the Minster. All consecrated buildings offered sanctuary, a cooling-off period while the clergy attempted to arrange a peaceful conclusion. Generally, you could only seek sanctuary for 40 days, and after that, if no conclusion was arrived at, you would have to leave the country. You'd be provided with a special outfit, carry a homemade wooden cross, have your thumb branded with the letter A, and then be told to hot-foot it to your nearest port. The amount of time given to reach the port was seemingly random. One sanctuary man was given 3 weeks to travel from Norwich to Portsmouth, whereas another unlucky fellow was given just 4 days for the same journey.
Once you reached the seaside, you'd be expected to get the first ship out of England. And for every day you didn't, you had to wade into the sea up to your knees as a sign of your willingness to go. It's the only known instance of paddling being used as a form of punishment.
For the discriminating sanctuary seeker, however, the most attractive feature about Beverley was that it could offer you protection from prosecution not just for 40 days, but for life.
To qualify for a permanent position as a sanctuary man, sanctuary seekers would have to make a full confession of their crime and have it recorded in a register, which was kept here in the Minster at Beverley. I've got a transcript here, and it makes fascinating reading. It seems that butchers were the most common perpetrators of violence. I can't think why. While the most frequent debtors were builders. So not much change there, then. The Minster is visible for miles around, and you can imagine it as a beacon attracting all the thieves and murderers and criminals of England to come and enjoy the amenities of this delightful town.
In London, the situation got so out of control, Parliament was petitioned over the way violent outlaws and criminals were using sanctuary as a legal hideout. By day, they lie low, and by night, they venture out to commit their murders, robberies, and felonies. But it wasn't just the church that was harbouring outlaws. So was that other great pillar of society, the gentry, some of whom were running crime syndicates from their castles. The truth is, there was very little difference between the outlaws and the fighting men of the gentry and aristocratic classes. In fact, very often they were one and the same. The Folville gang, for example, were in cahoots with the nobleman who ran this gaff, Rockingham Castle. Rockingham is in Northamptonshire, but it borders on 3 other counties. Leicestershire over there, and Rutland over there, and Cambridgeshire over there. And it was here that Sir Robert de Vere entertained fugitives and outlaws from all 4 shires. Sir Robert was meant to be the custodian of this royal castle and the keeper of the royal forest, and yet the whole place was a viper's nest of criminality. One contemporary wrote, "Sometimes 20 armed men, sometimes 30, come to De Vere at the castle, and they leave at dawn or during the night. He shuts the gate on the side facing the town, and they can leave secretly via a postern. Those bringing provisions to the castle are not allowed to enter, lest they should come to know those armed men. Very hugger-mugger." No wonder Parliament was repeatedly petitioned in the 14th century to stop these gentry gangs running wild. The Folvilles were a pretty rough lot. I mean, their leader, Eustace, had 5 murders and a rape to his name. And yet what happened to them? Did they hang on the gallows as they undoubtedly deserved? Well, not exactly. After 16 years of crime, all the surviving Folvilles were pardoned, and they died respectable men. Sir Eustace here was even knighted for his good services to the crown. But how could a violent outlaw like Eustace have become one of the king's trusted knights? Well, pardoning outlaws in return for military service allowed the king to harness the skills of these violent men to his own ends. And in the absence of a standing army, the country came to depend on them. In societies where violent conflict was common, courage and aggressiveness were prized qualities in a man. But there was something special about England. In the rest of Europe, knights were aristocrats and knighthood was inherited. But in England, just anyone could win a knighthood. The road to advancement meant being a warrior when there was a war on, and perhaps a robber when there wasn't. Sometime after his death, one of the chroniclers described Eustace not as a reformed murderer and rapist, but as a wild and daring man. The outlaw of reality had become one with the outlaw of legend. The story of Robin Hood wove together the myth of pre-conquest freedom together with the later myths of chivalry and knighthood. The English actually celebrated being a land of bold robbers. The story of the outlaw is not to be found on the periphery of English history. It lies close to the heart of what made England, England.